Hello and welcome. We have a really wonderful session today. I think you're going to find a lot of value in it. We're going to be diving into payment strategies and the relationship between the payments processing, your merchant account, how you manage your payments processing, and its direct connection to your financial health, your revenue, and your costs. Joining me today, I'm really excited to introduce Drew Edmond. Drew is an associate partner at Glenbrook Partners. If you're not familiar with Glenbrook, they are one of the most well-respected payments consulting firms, helping companies across some of the biggest brands in e-commerce and media. And what they do is they provide strategies to optimize the payments value chain, drive cost efficiencies, and of course, most importantly, increase revenue and improve customer experiences. So, Drew, welcome. We're so happy to have you today.
I'm very happy to be here, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Okay, so let's get started. And let's start talking a little bit about why this is so important, right? The merchant account health, I think, is often viewed as something that's just in the back office, and it's a necessary need to have for your e-commerce business. But the reality is that there is a direct connection between your merchant account health and revenue and costs, right? There are relationships between your payment approval rates and revenue. And then if you're not actually managing the merchant account well, often you can run into problems with chargebacks and refunds, which have very dramatic costs being posed by the merchant account network. I'd love to have you just talk about that a little bit and introduce our audience to why that's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, when I think about the kind of the flow of a transaction, right? You've got the merchant, who's listening to this today, and there's so much that you can do as a merchant. There's your PSPs that you're working with that are also doing things. There's the service providers that you're working with to try to improve your approval rates and all of that. At the end of the day, though, there's the issuing bank that's sitting on the other side that's making a decision on that transaction, and they're taking into account. They're seeing kind of the results of whatever's happening at the merchant or at the PSP or the service provider level. So they're looking at kind of the information associated with the transaction that's coming in. They're looking at and monitoring the KPIs and the trends in their own kind of payment processing environment. And they want to make the best decision on that transaction. If there are behaviors that they are noticing in their data that lead them to think that something is awry, something's going wrong from whether it's, something that usually it's something that's alerting them to say this may be fraudulent, right? If I'm retrying transactions too quickly, or if the data that's coming in isn't accurate, or it doesn't look like what they're expecting, they're gonna start thinking about the transactions that are coming through that channel as something that's problematic for them as a business, for potentially their customers. And so I think it's a balance of saying, all right, I know I as a merchant, or maybe my PSP or my service providers, we want to optimize these transactions. Of course, we want to capture as many good authorizations as possible. But if I'm not doing things to put in place the best practices in terms of mitigating fraud on the front end, or really managing kind of how those transactions are appearing to the banks, then the banks could ultimately start declining more transactions. And so now you're doing all this work, maybe you're spending money to try to optimize your transactions, but in reality, you're kind of subtracting from that effort by having the banks ultimately decline those transactions, and maybe potentially long-term think of you as a merchant as something that's problematic.
Yeah, I think that's such a strong, important message to send, right? One is that there are active steps that you as a merchant can take to present the transactions to the banks in a way that they will perceive as in the best interest. And also, secondly, to recognize that the banks, of course, have their motivation to approve as many transactions as possible, but they're managing their business, they're managing their risk profile. And so the way that they interact with merchants is going to affect how they view that risk assessment. And if it's not managed well by the merchant, then it has a chance of raising the flags with the bank, and that translates into higher rates of decline payments, right?
Absolutely. And I think one problem too is, if you there's kind of, and I think we'll get into kind of the importance of the data side, but just really having a holistic and comprehensive kind of view of what your payment retention, customer retention strategy is, and knowing what levers that you're pulling and what are the outcomes when it comes to chargebacks or declines, and knowing end to end what you're doing and what the output of that is. If you're not managing that and monitoring that, then you're kind of just flying blind, and you don't even really necessarily know what's happening. So you could be doing all this work up front, and on the back end, you're not monitoring what the output of those actions are, and you may not even know. You're like, oh, I'm doing all these best practices that I'm learning about, whether through the research that you're doing, conversations that you're having, but ultimately it could be negative consequences in the long run.
That's great. I know we're going to get into a lot more conversation about data, but I think that's been one of the key recommendations we're going to make is about, transparency to data and reporting out metrics for the payment system itself and within your operations to be able to make sure that there is enough of a view to managing this. So let's start talking about best practices, right? And I think the way that you frame the view that merchants should have that the payment cycle is not just when the payment is presented and it's approved or declined. The reality is that you really, as a merchant, want to think about it that there's processes before you actually submit transactions, what you do during the transaction submission process, and the opportunities to manage and optimize the process after the transactions have been submitted. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. So there's a whole host of things you can do kind of across this entire arrow, right? And I think that I've started calling it kind of hunting for basis points a little bit, because there's no silver bullet when it comes to perfectly optimizing your approval rates. There's a variety of different tactics that you can use to get to a point where you're feeling comfortable with, I'm doing basically all that I can, all that's under my power to be able to approve this, whether that's, you internally as a merchant working with the different service providers or things like that to optimize them. So the first part is, if you're thinking about before the transaction even occurs, you've got to really take a look at your payments environment to understand what do you have in place. Are you using the industry best practices or the tools and tactics that are available to you before the transaction even happens? Things, the kind of table stakes stuff that always comes up, things like account updater, right? If I got cards on file and the issuers and the networks are able to provide me with updated card credentials, of course, that's something that you need to take advantage of and make sure that either you or the payment service provider that you're working with enables you to gain access to those updated card credentials, whether that's in the batch format or the real-time account updater that some payment service providers have available. The next kind of level of that is network tokens. And, we could spend hours talking about network tokens. It's something that's been around for some years now, but it's something that's still gaining in popularity and ubiquity across issuing banks and usage at merchants, both kind of domestically, more widespread in the US, growing globally in different countries. But network tokens gives you an opportunity to say, well, I don't even have to use account updater. I don't have to use batch or real-time account updater. I can hold on to a token that's generated by the issuing bank or the network and have that card credential automatically updated on the back end. So there's no work on my end. I've got the token and I can use that. And that can lead to uplift because you're not having to worry about the credibility of that transaction. You know that it's live. You know that you have the most updated version of that credential. Another thing that you can think about in your payments environment and just your strategy for how you're approaching your business, particularly if you're a global business, is something like localization. So if you are a global merchant, you should start to understand, where am I seeing most of my volume, right? Maybe I started in the US and I started growing globally. Maybe in Europe, I'm starting to see a lot of transactions. Once it gets to a certain threshold, it may make sense to spend more time thinking about how am I localizing in these different countries, because that can lead to higher approval rates. And it definitely will lead to higher approval rates in some cases where you have things like local acquiring. Maybe you get to the size where it doesn't make sense just to use your US entity for payment processing. Maybe I need an entity in Europe to take advantage of local acquiring in Europe. Or wherever it may be, maybe you're more LATAM focused or Africa or Asia, wherever you may be. So there's different ways to take advantage of that, and that does lead to uplift. There's also things like processing in the currencies that those customers are expecting. If I'm in Europe, I kind of expect to see euros. If I'm in other countries, I expect to see the currency that's associated with my country, and that can, and the banks also see that, and for whatever reason, that leads to an uplift on their side as well. because it just looks more like the transactions they're expecting. If I'm a bank in France and I see a transaction on a U.S. card in USD, well, it's like, well, I'm a bank in France. I'm expecting my customer to primarily be transacting in euros, through a French merchant, things like that. So they make risk and fraud decisions based on location, even though we are of course in a global world and more transactions are happening kind of cross border. There's still kind of fraud models at the banks and things like that are leading to some of these downgrades in terms of approval rates. I'll move to the middle of the arrow. There's more to talk about on the front end, and we could literally spend all day talking about some of this stuff, and that's fine. So feel free if you have more questions about what you can do before, during, or after, in the Q&A, that's totally fine as well. During the transaction, all right, so the transactions come through, or we want to push the transaction through. What can you do kind of right within the realm of a few seconds before and after a transaction? What can you do, right? So let's say the payment fails. So in a world where you have multiple payment service providers, and that's becoming more and more popular these days, people are using orchestration layers to connect to multiple payment service providers. Have you established kind of who your primary payment service provider is for a particular set of your card portfolios? After you have a lot of data, you can start to understand, all right, these Visa debit cards, for whatever reason, are processing better over PSP-A. If that fails, I can fail over then to another PSP or even to another network, right? In the case of debit cards, where you have the opportunity to use payment service providers that are connecting to the pinless debit networks, the regional debit networks in the country, you might be able to get a transaction that didn't process over these signature rails to process over the pinless debit rails and get a success. We see that all the time with merchants that are doing this, kind of sophisticated fashion. Another one is failing over between network tokens and primary account numbers. So even if you have kind of your merchant tokens tokenized at a third party, you can still, whether that's a PSP or a third party token provider, you might start with a network token, because you think that gives you the best success rate. But if that fails, there are banks that where if you fail over to the original card number, that will go through as a success. So it's basically, you have to do some of this analysis, and sometimes you can work with folks to do this on your behalf. But thinking about what are the different routes, what are the changes that I can make at the time of the transaction to ultimately get a success on that particular transaction. The third piece I'll talk about on this one, and it's kind of gaining in popularity, I would say, is providing more enhanced data on a per issuer basis. So we're starting to see some movement here from different providers, from specific issuing banks, where if you're able to give them more data, and they're able to make a better decision, they're more confident in the kind of the riskiness of that transaction, the credibility of the buyer, et cetera. They're more likely to provide an approval. So that's an opportunity where you can think about, all right, am I working with PSPs that have these connections with these issuing banks, that have kind of advocacy on behalf of the merchant to say, hey, we can, if we can collect this data and send it through in various ways, then we have an opportunity to see higher approval rates. So I think that's a kind of a new and growing trend that I'm keeping a very close watch on, because I think it's super important and critical to the kind of the health of the ecosystem going forward. Finally, I'll touch on a couple points for after the transaction. Certainly, one of the biggest things that you can do is work with a provider like FlexPay to manage the retry logic on your behalf. Typically, a lot of merchants just don't have either the knowledge, the resources, et cetera, to be able to build that themselves. I'll let Steve talk about that. He's obviously much more knowledgeable about what FlexPay can do on your behalf than I am, because he works there. But there's other things you can do as well, right? You can surface local payment methods. Maybe if you're a global merchant, and maybe they started with card, and there's you're in the Netherlands, and they can say, hey, well, why don't you try this with Ideal in the Netherlands and see if that payment method goes through. Surface different options for them if you see a failure. A lot of this I haven't really talked much about, but just overall communication with the buyer, right? Whether that's before or after, or even during the transaction, if you have the opportunity to surface some sort of communication, whether that's in product, an email, a text, whatever, where you can say, hey, this payment's going to fail because maybe it's an expired card, or the payment did fail. What can we do to what can we communicate to them to remind them to update their card credential or payment credential? So I'll pause there. I just rambled for a while, so Steve, you can weigh in on this one.
Yeah, and just to dig in a little bit on the payment recovery, I mean, clearly when payments fail, particularly if your business model is a subscription business where you're expecting to be able to keep a customer alive and continue to bill for month after month after month, that's so tied to both revenue and profit growth. And that's core of the business model for a recurring billing company is that you want to increase the retention and maximize the LTV of the customer. And of course, failed payments that interrupt that have a hugely negative impact on the business. So that is what FlexPay does, of having very, very state-of-the-art solutions to be able to either interact with the banking system directly to recover the failed payment, or when necessary to create a great experience with your customers, to work with them and partner with them to have the information updated so that you can start to bill it successfully in the future. And I think that, Drew just gave us a very brief view into the masterclass behind really the complexity behind this. And I think most companies would look at payments with the assumption that the payment system is mature and stable and it just works as everybody thinks it should. What we are seeing, of course, is that there's an awful lot of work involved in order to get this to work well. And remember, when we started this conversation, we directly pointed out that your revenue is tied to your approval rates, and the costs that you incur from using the system in the form of your fees and your chargebacks and your refunds are all directly tied to managing this process. So the importance of it's incredibly high. And of course, as you become a larger company and you start operating in multiple geographic regions, the complexity just starts to grow. So it really points out the reason why companies like Lembook exist is because you really need to start working with experts that can help you manage this process, navigate it, and make sure that your payment system is working to really support your business the best possible way. Another reinforcement point of that is that when we look at companies, for example, that we work with FlexPay, we ran a survey last year, and what we found was that the companies that were working with third-party specialized solutions like FlexPay to manage the payment recovery after failed payments were 10 times more likely to be high financial performers than those that were trying to solve the problem internally. So what we see is that more and more as companies are starting to recognize that trying to maintain this expertise in a rapidly changing, very complex environment, it's almost impossible to manage this on your own. So working with advisors and companies that can support you is incredibly important and usually directly ties to business performance. So let's get a little more pragmatic now, Drew. Let's talk about what are some of the things that can be done, what are the best practices that companies can employ. So one of the areas that we see is making sure that the merchant account ID, the MID that the company chooses, is aligned to the business and what MasterCard, Visa, and the card networks expect. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about how the issuing banks are looking at the data that's coming in, right? That's how they're making decisions. Is they're interpreting whatever is sent to them, and that varies. It's going to vary on can vary on a merchant by merchant basis, especially as we start to get more and more advanced into, well, this set of merchants is sending this enhanced data that I was talking about. This merchant is sending a very unclear merchant descriptor. It's sending a lot of variation in some of the fields that occur in the authorization message, and so I think with the MID code specifically, it's around making sure that you're using your data is clean in terms of what you're sending, and so that they are making the best decision based on that. So I think from that perspective, that's probably the message that I would want to put out there.
And of course, the MID that's being submitted is one of the factors that the issuing banks really use in determining approval rates and the risk scores of transactions. So, choosing the best MID for your business, the right code, and aligning that with what the card networks expect is vitally important. And I think that the idea of managing chargebacks and refunds is what that really implies, that this can be a proactive process where you can reduce the quantity of chargebacks and refunds by the processes and the systems you employ versus just hoping that you get a good outcome, right? That's really, that's incredibly important best practice for companies to manage so that they both reduce their costs, their direct costs, but also the risk scores that the merchant accounts house, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you're looking at things like chargebacks and refunds, it's also telling you a little bit of a story too, right? It's also telling you a story around what's voluntary and what's involuntary when it comes to people that may not want to be using your product anymore, that have been experiencing failed payments. That's such a clear thing that you want to be able to differentiate between in your data. to understand, are these customers leaving because they either actively chose and said, I'm pressing cancel, or they maybe they know their card is failing and they don't want to be there anymore, and they're just letting that kind of passively allow them to voluntarily churn, like I often do with my gym subscription. But I think what's critical is digging into the data and understanding it, right? I think one critical piece anytime we're talking about data associated with this kind of stuff is decline reason codes. And an example that I see very commonly in merchants is that it started with PayPal, really. So PayPal has a decline reason code that says, hey, this customer actually went in through PayPal and canceled this subscription. But if we're not recognizing that change in that decline reason code, or knowing that even exists in the first place, that's still coming up under your involuntary churn. And so you might be retrying those payments, and those customers are saying, I already canceled this. Well, why? Or PayPal's looking at it and saying, this customer's already canceled this. So why are these retries coming through? And that can, if it ends up going through for whatever reason, that's going to lead to a refund. It's going to lead to a chargeback. Now we've got Visa and MasterCard who are coming out with tools for their issuing banks to say, hey, if you're an issuing bank and you want to provide this tool to your bank, the cardholder customers, and allow them to manage their subscriptions within the bank portal and cancel subscriptions there. Well, now all of a sudden we're going to have merchants saying, all right, we've got all these declines, but if you're not recognizing that there's a particular decline reason code coming through associated with those specific cancellations, that's voluntary churn. And if you're not categorizing that effectively, that's going to look like involuntary churn, and you're going to keep that in your system. You're going to keep retrying it. It's going to lead to more chargebacks, more refunds. So it's really being aware and on top of kind of what's happening in the ecosystem from a scheme perspective, Visa, MasterCard, all the card brands, from and beyond the card brands, right? Even networks like PayPal, whatever payment methods you're accepting, what does the data look like? How do I categorize it effectively? How do I make sure that my kind of internal dashboards and things like that are accurately categorizing what's going on? And are my processes matching up with that data as well? And then ultimately, you want to make sure that you're just keeping generally an eye on what are your chargeback rates? What are your refund rates? If I make a particular change to some cohort of my customers because I think it's going to lead to better approval rates, well, I'm also, developing some way, a report or a dashboard or whatever it is, to understand is that test that I'm running, or is that change that I've implemented resulting in any meaningful changes on these metrics? So it's a really critical piece. If it's something that can get out of control, and especially if it's something that you're not looking at, it's something that's going to harm you over time. And so you have to get ahead of it. You have to be aware of what's going on.
Yeah, and I think the area of data is one that we probably could talk about for 4 hours and not even scratch the surface. The reality is that the information that becomes available to you through the networks and the payments information through Churn really is a gold mine. And the value is not just being able to operationalize the data, like Drew suggested, to be able to make sure you're taking advantage of all the data that's available, like decline codes and reason codes for why somebody churned, but put it in formats where you can start to analyze it and combine it with your operational data. Again, one of the key insights is making sure that you track your involuntary churn rates, where you're connecting why a failed payment and whether or not that ended a customer relationship. Why that's so important is, I think, if you are still treating all of your churn as voluntary churn, where you think that the reason that a relationship ended is because the customer chose to cancel, and you're trying to employ save processes and methods and customer service outreach, trying to get them to come back, and that wasn't the reason that they ended. In fact, they had no intention of ending their relationship with you, then you're applying the wrong tool to help solve the problem. So, one of the recommendations we always make is that understanding the right metrics to be able to start tracking and reporting, and then sharing those broadly, making sure they're being pushed up to upper management, so that the key metrics that really tie to approval rates and retention, revenue and profits are being not just measured but tracked, and the goal is being set against making those specific improvements to getting better outcomes. Another good example is for failed payments specifically, when if you are a company that's using your customer service team to drive outreach to try to help the customers resolve the problem, we found that often the way that experience unfolds has a direct relationship on the customer's relationship with your brand. For example, our research tells us that as soon as one of you, a subscription customer is aware of a failed payment, their brand satisfaction drops for over 30% of your customer base. And that makes sense, right? I mean, if you're a consumer and your card is working at every other merchant you try, but was declined with one brand, what happens is that consumer blames you, the brand, not the bank, which is actually the entity, of course, that declined the payment. So understanding the relationship between customer satisfaction, payments outcomes, retention, really gives you many more tools that you can start to employ to make sure that you're managing these and getting the best possible outcomes.
Fully agree. Fully agree. And I'll just I know we only have a few minutes left. A couple points just on the last slide to think about is just making sure that your data environment is set up right so you can do these analyses in the first place. You've got internal data, right? So you've got your customers, your subscriptions, your invoices, your transactions. All that stuff needs to be linked together and categorized effectively so that you can actually do this analysis. And then you've also got to have your kind of your external data, right? Anything that you're getting from your PSPs, your service providers that you can either use individually or kind of mash all that stuff up together to say, all right, I've got all these different variables and filters. Now I need to start thinking about how to best cut this data to understand what these outcomes are. Either you're going to build that in-house, you're going to work with a third-party platform that can help you build those dashboards, but you have to have a robust data environment, or else you can't even ask these questions really because you don't have the data to answer them.
Yeah, and often we find that companies, even if they go through the exercise of building the data environment, the data lakes to be able to store and allow the analysis to take place, don't know what questions to ask, don't know what good looks like, what is a benchmark that they compare themselves to, and understand whether or not they're driving a good outcome or one that has opportunities for improvement. So that's why companies are, again, like FlexPay and Glenberg exist to be able to help you through that process. Because it's so crucial. If you don't know the questions to ask, you don't know how to really understand to get better outcomes. So we are going to be running out of time here. I wanted to introduce one thought that's very positive, though, and all this complexity and some of the problems that companies run into. The reality is that technology and solutions are going to be coming over the next 2 years, 1 year. That's going to start to help to improve upfront approval rates. It's an enormous problem. It's affecting companies in pure e-commerce business models with subscription billing models. Obviously, as all the fraudsters, the bad actors, the black hats have moved online to conduct their fraud. They're employing ever more sophisticated tactics and technologies like AI and machine learning, trying to scam the system. And the banks are responding with ever more protections to limit their exposure to this risk. But there are solutions that will be coming that will be working with the banks to try to increase the trust and transparency across all players, the merchants, the end consumers, and the banks. Allow more information to be presented at the time of authorization decision that the current system doesn't allow, and both reduce the fraud losses for banks, but also increase the approval rates for merchants, which is really the goal of all entities here, right? The banks don't want to decline transactions that turn out to be legitimate. They only want to decline the transactions that are fraudulent. We share the same goals, right? We want the banks to have fewer losses. We want them to approve the transactions, which helps the merchants and customers. So stay tuned. There is going to be help on the way, and we'll be able to talk about that in the next 6 months or a year. Any last thoughts, Drew, before we go into Q&A?
I mean, I think that when you think about what you can do as a merchant, there's kind of a few different categories of things that typically come up. I think it's around what can I do from a product perspective. I think one thing that I've learned over doing a lot of these engagements with different merchants is that you end up learning a lot about your business beyond, if I come in, I'm doing just like an involuntary churn kind of assessment and strategy, it ends up being much broader than that because you end up learning things about your product or your customers that you didn't think about. So once you have kind of access to this data, it feeds not just your payment strategy. It feeds not just, what am I doing with my data environment? It also teaches you about how customers might be interacting or who are my customers? What kind of cards are they using? What type of individuals are there? How old are they? What types of banks do they work with? How much, am I seeing a lot of insufficient funds because, maybe it's a younger cohort or whatever it might be. So that can also affect how you think about the product side, whether that's the billing cadence with which you bill your customers or specific customers, the pricing that you might use. Once you get a sense of kind of how are these things declining, on an average ticket and things like that. What kind of control do my customers have over their subscriptions, and how is that impacting various types of churn? So I just think there's so much to unpack. Obviously, we could spend 10 more webinars talking about all these different things. But, there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, it's a really important thought, I think, for everybody to as we start to wind down with the structured part of our presentation. I think even going back to looking at where you acquire your customers, are the relationships between some problems that occur from certain sources that might be more high risk, and so there's a wealth of information that starts to be unlocked by the data and asking the right questions. We do have one question. It's currently in our Q&A. Drew and I will stay online for a few more minutes, so if you have a question, please feel free to use it. And we will get back to you in real time, or if we end this webinar, we will be able to follow up with you through email. We do have a question from Lindsay. Lindsay asks, and I think this is for you, Drew, what are the different recommendations that you've offered to clients that have had direct and most significant uplift towards payment approvals and reducing involuntary churn?
Great question. One, I'll caveat it first by saying that it's been surprising to me how different that answer has been on a kind of merchant by merchant basis in some cases. It really depends on kind of where you are, what you're doing today in your environment to say, all right, given where I am, what can I do to uplift this? That being said, I think that one of the some of the major kind of uplifts that you see when we talk about things like dynamic routing, using multiple payment service providers, thinking about being like, if you can get to the level of sophistication where you are understanding where different parts of your portfolio are performing better on a kind of PSP by PSP basis, that can really lead to a lot of improvements, and something that you have to monitor, and it changes over time, and it can take a lot of resources to get to that point. But you can start small. If maybe I started with just one PSP, make sure you fully understand and benchmark the data associated with that PSP, and then as you start to kind of mature and become more sophisticated, now you're adding one more PSP, and you're able to benchmark that PSP and then start to do some of the analysis, or work with a provider that can help you with that kind of routing logic, as those types of service providers are starting to emerge more and more today. That's where you can really find, it's surprising to me, and it's kind of it's almost silly, right? It's like, why if I go down this PSP is this card getting approved versus this? It's the same card, it's the same transaction, same customer, same merchant, same bank. The only thing that's different is the PSP. That being said, you see wide variety in approval rates. And again, that's on a per merchant basis. It's not that necessarily this PSP is this much better than this one. It's that for whatever reason, all the different variables and factors, MCC codes and location and all the things that, in some cases there are PSPs that are, actively doing things to help try to optimize. And that's great to kind of push everything forward in the ecosystem. But as it stands today, and as it will stand for, I think, a long time going into the future, there are quite significant variances in the success rates that you see across different PSPs. As a result, being able to understand what's the optimal for me on how many PSPs I should be using, which ones they are, and being able to route those transactions can ultimately lead to some nice improvements in approval rates. But again, I'll go back to my phrase earlier about hunting for basis points. There's no silver bullet. This is a war of multiple attacks on your approval rates. And you have to think about it holistically. Again, before, during, and after the transaction, you have to look at it holistically, because it's not going to be a silver bullet.
So hunt for basis points, and everything matters is the conclusion that everybody should walk away with.
That's right.
Well, thank you everybody for joining. I hope you found value. This was a really wonderful conversation. The neat thing about this is we are going to follow up this session, I believe in the month of June, with a more advanced session. We can go into more detail. I think it's a great opportunity. If you have specific questions about your business that are a little bit more involved, please feel free to drop a note. You can use the reply on the email for the invite for the session, or submit it directly to Drew or myself in the chat box, and we will be able to respond to you. But thank you very much, Drew. Thank you. This was a great opportunity for you to be able to share some of your expertise, the payment system, and to give at least a starter course and understanding for merchants how many variables are, but also the opportunities that can be unlocked by properly managing and working to reduce your costs and improve your revenue.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.